Hello and welcome to everyone joining us today through Zoom or through the Middle East Council on Global Affairs YouTube channel. This webinar will be in English, but there is a simultaneous Arabic translation that you can choose by clicking on, there is a globe sign at the bottom and then choosing Arabic for interpretation. Unfortunately, our guests and colleagues on YouTube, there is no translation option for that. My name is Ahmed Mursi. I'm a visiting fellow at the Foreign Policy and Security Program at the Middle East Council, where I focus on the Middle East and the Horn of Africa, interconnected geopolitical, security, and economic dynamics. I'll be moderating today's webinar with esteemed colleagues and friends, and this is one of several webinars that we are planning at the Middle East Council over the coming months on critical topics and issues linking the Middle East and Africa at large. Before introducing the topic and my colleagues, let me describe how this event is going to run. So I will introduce each of them and the topic, and each of them will have 7 minutes to respond and give opening remarks to a prompt that I will ask. This will be followed by another round of short reflections from each of them, and then we will open for questions and answers from the audience. You can write your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom, and you can do so anonymously or in Arabic if you prefer. Today's webinar focuses on the ongoing war in Sudan since April 2023 between the two warring factions that we hear about the most in the media, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. This crisis or this war have ensued or led to a lot of crises that we will try to entangle and understand today by the panel of experts that we are having, who will look at helping us understand the situation on the ground, recent updates, balance of power, areas of influence for the warring factions, but also the unfolding multi-layered humanitarian disaster that we are seeing on a daily basis. And finally, we will have also a conversation around the role of external actors in the conflict and any potential influence any of them might have on reaching a ceasefire and peace in Sudan. I'll start by introducing my three colleagues by their order of speaking. So I'll start with Nafisa Al-Tahir, who is a journalist and currently Reuters correspondent covering politics and economics in Sudan and Egypt. Her work has focused on the Sudanese uprising, economic crisis, and transitional period. Previously, Nafisa has covered the Gulf region, based out of Dubai. And before Reuters, she was a fellow at The Intercept after graduating from Columbia University's Journalism School and Harvard University. William Carter is Sudan's country director at the Norwegian Refugee Council. He has led NRC operations in Sudan for over 4 years, and in 2024 has, with his team, assisted over 1 million Sudanese through this war. Prior to Sudan, William has worked for a decade with humanitarian NGOs and UN agencies in countries in crises like Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, among others. He holds an executive MBA and an MSc in Defense, Development, and Diplomacy, and he studied philosophy and Arabic for his bachelor's degree. And last but not least, Khulud Khair, who is a Sudanese political analyst and the founding director of Confluence Advisory, a think and do tank in Khartoum. She's also a radio broadcaster, hosting and co-producing a weekly radio program called Spotlight 249, and 249 is the country code for Sudan, for those who are not familiar. That's Sudan's first English language political discussion and debate show that is aimed at Sudanese youth. Khulud has over a decade of experience in research, aid programming, and policy in Sudan across the Horn of Africa. So thank you for the three of you for joining us today, and thanks for everyone who's joining us again on this important conversation. I'll start with Nafisa. And Nafisa, my main prompt for you is, what is the reporting from the ground telling us about the developments of the war? What are the missing components, or what should we know that we're not following? Is the war simply an infighting between these two warring factions within the army, or there are other elements that we are completely ignoring or not seeing in the war so far? You have 7 minutes, and We look forward to your reflections.
It started freezing for a second there, but hopefully it'll be smooth sailing. Yeah, thank you for having me. It's nice to be here and to be talking alongside Will and Khulud, who are two people whose insights I rely on quite a bit in my own reporting. So yeah, I'm gonna try to give everyone here kind of a quick and dirty explanation of what's happening in Sudan. And I think in the process of that, I'll try and pick out a few things that we're not paying attention to. And like you said, also this idea of kind of who's actually fighting this war, right? Because I think, like you said, we do kind of talk about the two sides, and I'm definitely guilty of saying that, but there's really a lot of complexity there. So, for those kind of completely new to what's happening in Sudan, the RSF controls around half of the country. And the Sudanese army controls the other half. RSF was prior to the war an official kind of legitimized, legalized part of the armed forces, but that's since changed. The RSF specifically controls the capital Khartoum, or the vast majority of the capital Khartoum, Jazeera State, and to the south, the Darfur and Kordofan regions to the west. But there are holdouts within those areas, so that includes Al Fashir, which I'll return to, but is one of the sites of where we're seeing not just the army fighting, but also the joint forces, including Mini Minawi and Jibril Ibrahim's forces, among others, and those are former rebel leaders who are now part of the government. There's also Al Ubaid, the capital of North Kordofan, which is a major city in Sudan, that is also still controlled by the army, as well as parts of South Kordofan and North Darfur, which are controlled by rebel leaders. So Abdelaziz al-Hilu in South Kordofan and Abdul Wahid Noor in parts of North Darfur. But I think, although there are these little caveats, all of these other places, the army's locations, these other groups' locations, they are essentially kind of surrounded, except for Hilu, but the rest are kind of surrounded by the RSF. And the army in particular is quite isolated in the areas that it still controls in those parts of the country. And these RSF-controlled areas are essentially cut off from most of the signs of a functioning state. The people there have been subject to a litany of atrocities that go all the way up to allegations of ethnic cleansing in West Darfur, and there, not only the RSF, but also allied Arab militias. And there's a very kind of porous line between the RSF and those militias fighting there, and those militias have also kind of swept through other parts of the country as well. And yeah, it's just important to say, I think kind of that pattern that we saw in West Darfur, we have started seeing in other parts of the country to a lesser extent, but it's something that we should really be paying attention to, the ethnic nature of the fighting. And also moving to the army-controlled areas, the ethnic nature of some of the targeting of some populations, particularly from Darfur, that happens in army areas. So the army controls the north and the east of the country, roughly, although the RSF has made and is making kind of inroads in several front lines. Those areas do have more of what you would call a functioning government, although very poorly functioning. But we're seeing there a resurgence of the Islamist government officials allied to Ahmed al-Bashir. And like I said, you're seeing a lot of targeting of politicians, of activists, of humanitarian workers, despite kind of the lack of any political or outward political affiliation. And so I think that's something else that we've tried to convey in our reporting, but I think needs more reporting and more attention. Is just kind of really what's happening in army controlled areas. You know, they're safe, yes, but there's still a lot of things happening there. So just to kind of, that's kind of the overarching image. I'll be trying to be quick. I hope I still have a little bit more time. But the past few months have been Sudan's rainy season, so things have been a bit calmer. On the fighting side, it has seen an intensification, as I'm sure Will is going to mention, of the suffering that's caused by the war, of the hunger, disease caused by the war. But I'll let him kind of get us a little bit more into that. Before the rainy season, and now that we're out of the rainy season, fighting has focused around Sinnar state, which the RSF had managed to take control of, but the army has been fighting to win back, as well as Al-Fashir, which is the last holdout in Darfur, as I mentioned. And there, I think, like I said, the army has this alliance with Minawi and with Jibril Ibrahim, that is starting to kind of show signs of fracturing on a political level. There's been a lot of back and forth in Port Sudan, and that's something that we should really be keeping an eye on as well, because they do seem to be kind of a big part of the reason why Al-Fashir is still not controlled by the RSF. And as I think a lot of people have warned, if it does fall under RSF control, that could really see some very intense violence. So I think the last thing that I'll say is that we are seeing a shift from the army being kind of largely on the back foot since the start of the war. It has kind of been gaining a little bit of an edge. It seems to have some improved capabilities. That has to do with a lot of the regional dynamics that I think Khulud will get into. And that's allowed it to regain some territory in Sinnar, some territory in Khartoum, but it really remains to be seen kind of how much of a sea change that makes in the war. And I think the last thing I'll say is the RSF kind of, since we're talking about who's fighting this war, the RSF has always kind of been very fragmented, very much a mishmash of what you could call kind of regular trained forces, but overwhelmingly kind of ethnic, tribal militias, as well as people from across Sudan's borders. And so we're seeing that fragmentation is starting to be increasingly problematic. We're seeing increased signs of a lack of command control, although I want to be clear that a lack of command control does not absolve the wider leadership of responsibility or accountability, or kind of particularly of setting up this kind of model for fighting and the atrocities that have happened since then. But that dynamic should also be looked at a little bit closer, and that's something that we're trying to do. And it seems to have led to some of the army's gains. And then just the last thing is, in terms of hopes for an end to the war, efforts so far have really failed. And I kind of, if I had to look into the future, I do see the army digging in a little bit. It's making gains, which is galvanizing people. The RSF is also perpetrating quite brutal attacks currently in Jazeera state, and that's really galvanized a lot of people against the RSF and against peace efforts. And so that should kind of be paid attention to, I think, particularly by people who are trying to bring this war to an end. I'll stop there. I hope that was intelligible in terms of just a primer for people.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for being on time, whether you planned it or not. So I think you have left us with a couple of interesting follow-up questions that not only talks about internal dynamics in Sudan, but also can expand into when we get to talk about external players and regional players and the conversation with Khulud. So Will, I'd like to turn to you. You have had years and years of experience, not just in Sudan, but other conflict zones and wars. And I'd like you to give us and all of us a perspective of this multi-layered humanitarian crisis that we're seeing in Sudan, that is not only about food and healthcare that are acute, that are famine, but also destruction of infrastructures, IDPs, the internally displaced Sudanese, that even go before the war started, and other refugees that have sought refuge in neighboring countries. So I think giving us this, and I know it's a very tough thing to do, but I think putting this into perspective for all of us is very important. And if you can, towards the end, give us also a perspective of how does this look different or maybe similar to other cases that you have engaged with or other contexts. So also there are ways for some of us to understand the grave issues that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Ahmed, and to everyone who's tuned in. Yeah, I'll speak from a humanitarian perspective, and I can start by quite clearly saying how brutal, how large, and how complex this whole crisis is for millions of people in Sudan. Even before this round of war erupted in April last year, there were perhaps around 3 million people still living in protracted states of internal displacement, particularly around the Darfur region and also in Kordofan and Blue Nile state. Today, we have estimated over 11 million people in internal displacement and over 3 million people having left the country mostly to seek safety elsewhere, particularly in Egypt, South Sudan, and Chad. So just the scale of this is huge, much larger than many other crises. It is the largest internal displacement crisis in the world right now. A month ago or so, I was with our teams in the east of Sudan, areas controlled by the armed forces, and in Gedaref state, which we had originally set up an office to help people who fled from northern Ethiopia, from the Tigray region, refugees, but now had to turn into a space that is really helping overwhelming numbers of displaced Sudanese people. And many of the people that we'd met and I'd met, they originally were in Khartoum when artillery and airstrikes started, and then they came to Al Jazeera state, which then was taken over a few months later, and then they left to go to Sennar state, and that was also followed and partially captured. And so this was the third time they had fled with only some of their family members, with almost no belongings, with huge exhaustion, emotional, understandably, issues as well. So the numbers only paint a little bit of this pretty bleak picture of what people are having to go through at the moment. And even the last few weeks, there's been massacres in Al Jazeera state, and over 100,000 people having fled again. We have some teams trying to respond along with many others, along with emergency rooms and other community-led efforts as well. But there's just the scale of need is not matched by the support to those responding, to the support that's needed to help people, and most importantly, to efforts to prevent this whole level of suffering in the first place. So just the scale of displacement, I think, is a huge indicator. The severity of this crisis is, isn't spoken to really. And I think to come to some other aspects of this complex emergency, there's a displacement crisis. There's a food insecurity crisis. I'll come back to that. Protection crisis, a health crisis, state failure, lack of basic services crisis, all compounding, all sort of layered on top of one another. Even this has been the sort of first famine declaration in decades, just in one of the places that we have some idea of, one of the largest long-term displacement camps in North Darfur, Zamzam camp, but over 11 other localities at risk or suspected levels at similar levels too. But almost 25 million people or more in sort of emergency or crisis levels of food insecurity. But we're operating a little bit in the dark. A lot of the telecoms are down, a lot of the health surveillance, public health aspects are not functioning. So we might only be seeing the upper half of this iceberg, so to speak. And so, in the past, Sudan, the humanitarian story is one of long-term displacement and some chronic food insecurity. And now we've seen this multiplied and made much more severe in the last 18 months of this war. And within that, some other emergencies happening too within the displacement crisis. You mentioned the rainy season and floods. Well, there's over 23,000 cholera cases recorded already, and that's with just a collapsed healthcare system. So we're not even seeing the majority, over around 700 people confirmed dead from cholera outbreaks within this huge displacement and pretty squalid and abjectly poor conditions. We're also seeing the collapse of basic services, so not just the healthcare situation, but the fact that children aren't being vaccinated, that young people aren't able to learn anything, and not in any sort of protected or safe environment there. No banking, people can't access funds for their livelihoods, for their business, for their savings. So the sort of secondary effects of this war are compounded across the whole very, very large population. So for us, it's a really a grotesquely bleak picture. There is a little bit of a response, not enough of a humanitarian response. Great work by locally led efforts, some work by the international system. And to be honest, it feels like a diplomatic effort, still in a little bit of disarray to either end the war or to improve respect for international humanitarian law that would limit the suffering, limit the atrocities, the starvation strategies, the collateral damage, and so forth. So it's really not where it needs to be. And as we look down, and Nafisa touched upon this, we don't really see anything that would spark our hope that there's going to be a nationwide ceasefire or peace process in the immediate future. We can hope in the medium term, but our planning assumptions are this will get larger and will get worse, unfortunately, in the coming months and year ahead. And we've got to get everyone to pull together. And and just to round off from this opening point, that I've seen a few pretty hard crises in the world, civil wars, insurgencies. This is, I guess, the first famine that I've worked in, but the scale is not commensurate with what generally we have to work with, and certainly what I've seen before. Usually there's some aspect of complexity. There's in war zones, not everyone gets the food they need to thrive or even survive. But this, again, the scale, the depth, the fact that the starvation strategies applied is a whole different level. So it just feels like we've gone through this first 18 months, and now a new chapter of the war, a new chapter of suffering, more atrocities, more desperation, less services. There is something happening, but not enough, and it definitely could be scaled up a bit more to help many more people survive. I'm very happy to continue. Back over to you, Ahmed. Thank you.
Thank you, William. And it's a sobering kind of assessment, especially with what seems to be we're getting into a new wave of not just atrocities and attacks, but also humanitarian-wise, climate-induced as well as we get into the winter and get into more rainy season. Khulud, I'd like to turn to you to take us through a view from inside out and outside in the sense that the impact of the Sudan war, regionally speaking, so inside out, and then looking from outward towards Sudan, how does the regional, international players, countries, influencers are contributing or trying to help or trying to fuel this war? I'd like to just give us some sort of a sense, and maybe towards the end, as I did with Nafisa and William, if you think there could be any coalition of states or of the willing who can tip the scale to really push for something
تحالف ربما لعدد من
meaningful.
الدول أو من
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I mean, I think that's a lot to cover, so I'll do my best in 7 minutes. So inside out, I think one thing we have definitely seen is that while this war started off as, two distinct camps going at it over largely national level issues related to, the balance of power in Khartoum and what the future of Sudan sort of post-Bashir would shape up to be, we're increasingly seeing this sort of fragmentation across both sides, both sort of on the RSF side, and the RSF is much more of a franchise really than it is a sort of a proper army. And so groups opt in and they opt out of the RSF, and that has caused significant destabilization within the ranks of the RSF. But for the SAF too, because they've historically lacked an infantry, they have relied on militias, either ideological militias or ethnic militias, to bolster their numbers. And so they're also that side is also sort of a loose mosaic of different armed groups, including some of the former rebels in Darfur, now called the Joint Forces. And so you have a lot more, sort of different moving parts to this than when the war first started. But what we're seeing is, as time goes by, that this war has a centrifugal effect. So something that started off in Khartoum, something that started off with a few, sort of specific actors, has now drawn in and continues to draw in different actors from across the country. And of course, inevitably, also in the region and further afield globally. And so what we have is an inability of this war to be decided by the actors that started it, if essentially, without at least negotiating with so many other actors, both domestic and international. And when it comes to, for example, the Joint Forces, as Nafisa said, they have actually been the backbone of the war effort in Al-Fashir, keeping Al-Fashir out of RSF hands. And what this means is that because the Joint Forces, these armed groups, are constituted from ethnic groups, this war is increasingly going to become, and it already has become, but it will increasingly become, very much ethnically driven. And this means that the level of atrocity, the level of violence we see goes up several notches, but also the typology of violence, very much atrocity violence, will also go up. And this means that countries that share a border with Sudan, also share communities with Sudan, will invariably also get sucked in. Chad is a very good example of this, because there are ethnic groups in Darfur that, know no borders between Sudan and Chad, and they are also being sucked into this dynamic, thinking here particularly of the Zaghawa tribal group, of which the Chadian president is one, being pulled into the war in Darfur, and he now finds himself having to balance between his political interests at the national level, very much tied into the Gulf, particularly the UAE, and his local level interest tied into his ethnic group and their campaign against the RSF in Darfur. And what this means is that we're going to increasingly see countries and groups in the region that is around Sudan being pulled into this conflict. For example, if the RSF makes moves into northern state, which borders Egypt, we may see the Egyptians also feeling very anxious about what that looks like, and that may or may not implicate them further in this conflict. So the spillover effect of this war is very real, and it's happening in real time. And I think so many of us have been warning about this from the outset, but it's difficult, I think, to sort of fully grasp for some what the lay of the land is, because you have, for example, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iran firmly backing the Sudanese Armed Forces, and the United Arab Emirates firmly backing the Rapid Support Forces, with some countries backing both, for example, like Russia and Israel. And they find it very difficult to the sort of the different constituent parts, both inside Sudan and outside Sudan, find it very difficult to follow what's going on and try to stay ahead of, particularly in terms of messaging, what the different constituent parts are getting up to. So it's become very much this sort of chaotic landscape now, both in terms of domestic actors and international actors. But I think one thing we have seen is that during the rainy season, which tends to see slightly less proliferation of violence, particularly because the RSF is a territorial army or territorial group, and they can't move when it's the rainy season and the flooding season. But during that time, we saw something of an arms race by the SAF and by the RSF. And so now that it's the beginning of the dry season, now that it's October, November, we're going to see a lot more violence that is a direct result of all of these weapons that have been accumulated in Sudan over the past few months by international actors, particularly the SAF leaning on, Iran, leaning on Egypt to some degree, Turkey and others, and the RSF leaning more and more onto the United Arab Emirates and other countries in the region, for example, Kenya, Uganda, and Chad, to facilitate those arms transfers for the RSF. This means that so many countries are implicated in this war. And the way we think about how we end this war now invariably includes the tensions, for example, between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, not just what is going on in Sudan between the SAF and the RSF and their allied militias. And also at the same time, what's going on at the African Union and who has the balance of power, the African Peace and Security Commission. So when we think about how we end this war, it is very unlikely, both because it is now the beginning of the fighting season again, and so many arms have been amassed, but also because just so many countries are involved and implicated to a greater degree than when the war started, that has now become sort of an entangled mess. But when it comes to sort of the past few months and then the positioning of the SAF and the RSF, what we expect to see on the ground militarily now is a sort of a proliferation of active front lines. Last year, what we saw was, first it was Khartoum and the war started, then the fighting moved to Darfur. And when the fighting went from one place to the other places were relatively frozen with a few skirmishes. What we're likely to see this time is several active conflict zones and front lines at the same time. And indeed, we saw that with the beginning of the Sudanese Armed Forces offensive, launched in Khartoum and increased in El-Fasher at the same time in eastern Jazeera and also in Sinnar. What this means is, because we know this is very much a war on civilians, I think Will has sort of shown that the impact has mostly been on armed civilians. We're expecting to see that the humanitarian situation will increase exponentially. We're already seeing, figures of people dying of starvation, sort of increasing with time. There are recent reports done through some number crunching that say that, a potential 12 million people may die of famine by next June. And even if half of that figure, even if it ends up being half of that figure, that is still an incredible amount of people that are suffering as a direct result of not just sort of the violence caused by the war, but more so actually by the tactics used by both sides, with cover from their international actors. I mean, if you read every single sort of governmental statement that is produced, particularly from the region on Sudan, it is very much either designed to create cover or to sort of, shirk responsibility, despite the fact that some of these countries are directly involved. And that doesn't help move things along in terms of the humanitarian response. So I think we're seeing an entanglement here, both within Sudan domestically and a fragmentation, but also we're seeing that being sort of mirrored in the regional and Gulf picture as well. Just lastly, because I know my time is up, I'm often told that what will decide this war, for example, is, what is happening between Iran and the UAE, or Saudi Arabia and the UAE, or Egypt and other countries. And I think we have to sort of pay attention to that regionalized picture, but we also mustn't, sort of obfuscate the role that domestic actors can play. There are certainly proxy elements that have become very visible within this war, but this is a war started by Sudanese against Sudanese. And therefore, a lot of the way that this war becomes resolved has to rest on the dynamics that are at play within the country, particularly impunity for grievous acts of atrocity, as well as sort of a political dispensation that is equal and fair and is able to respond to what Sudanese people have said they wanted, an end to militarism, a civilian and democratic Sudan. Thanks.
Thank you, Khulud. This has been really, really helpful, and I thank you to Nafisa and William also for connecting all of these dots together. And I think it's very, very important that we're listening to your assessments and your analysis, even though this is not something new and this has been mentioned before, but I think it's important to bring it all together. And I encourage all the people who are watching us on Zoom or following us on Zoom to send your questions through the Q&A. I already have a list of questions that I can monopolize and the time with, but I'd love to get more from the audience. I'd like to ask a main question for the three of you, and we will go in the reverse order briefly. We'll start with Khulud, then William, then Nafisa. And the question is particularly media coverage. And I think the three of you have talked more or less about media without saying media necessarily. But I think I'd be really interested in your view on the role of the media coverage not just on Sudan, if you want to also talk about other cases or examples, but since we're talking about Sudan, because it seems like there is an attempt, one way or the other, by some of the media coverage to kind of dehumanize, depoliticize, and obscure the responsibilities of the actors, whether they are domestic or international. And I wonder, how does this affect your work, research work, coverage in terms of journalism, or humanitarian work? I think William talked briefly about it, but we'll go back to this. So, Khulud, how do you read this? How do you see this? And what can be done about it from your view?
Thanks. I mean, I think we have to disaggregate between, for example, Western media and regional media, particularly the one in Arabic, led mostly by, international news channels in the sort of Gulf region. When we think about international media, it's very clear that Sudan does not make the headlines, even though it's the world's largest displacement, hunger, humanitarian, and protection crisis. And the reason for that is obvious. There is a taxonomy of suffering, there's sort of a hierarchy of suffering globally, and Sudanese people are not at the top of that. And that is very much a racialized hierarchy. I mean, for example, we hear very little about Congo because that's even further down the rung than Sudan. So I think that is a reality we're faced with. Sudan makes the news only when, sort of really terrible things happen, but there's no consistent basis. What I've been saying to decision makers in the West, who always sort of bemoan the lack of media attention that Sudan has, is that they shouldn't have to wait for headlines to work on Sudan, to really push for a solution on Sudan, because they already know the facts. They don't need, something to make the headlines to know that. When it comes to the regional picture, particularly Arabic language news, it's interesting because there are obviously biases there, thinking especially of, for example, Sky News Arabia, which is housed in the United Arab Emirates and definitely has a pro-RSF slant. But there are also, other types of media as well that tend to sort of back, if you will, the institution of the military, and therefore have a very sort of pro-SAF and sometimes pro-Islamist slant. For example, Al Jazeera Arabic tends to and has always for decades had that slant. And so, I think Sudanese people are very good at reading between the lines. They've had to be, those of us particularly who have lived through the Bashir era, we've become very accustomed to reading between the lines. But that doesn't mean that you don't get these these narratives that could seem true and then aren't. I think that the solution to all of this, both the apathy on sort of in Western media, but also the very sort of political motivations in regional media, is that, we need to rely more on local journalism and journalism by Sudanese people, because they're the ones with the best on the ground access, particularly where Western journalists, for example, can't get into the country. And there are very sturdy, very sort of well-researched news articles coming out, for example, from the Ain network, which has been around for some time. And I think we should be relying much more on those to get news sources. But of course, then we triangulate and do everything else that we need to do to make sure that it's actually true. But I think we need to stop relying on international media and start much more relying on local media, just like we've seen with humanitarian aid and ceasefires and protection. Localization really is, I think, where the future is at on this one.
Thank you. Will, how does this, of course, I mean, as a largest displacement, all this famine, hunger, the health, does this impact the media coverage? Does it take away? Do you need more? I mean, again, I wonder how you're reading this or thinking about it in your line of work.
Yeah, thanks, Ahmed. And I can't disagree with any of Khulud's analysis, and can see clearly a racialized hierarchy of why Sudan and Sudanese suffering is not further up in the agenda. There's been, a famine declaration, atrocity alerts left, right, and center. This is just the tip of the iceberg, and that's barely breaking through into the news reel. And it just feels ridiculous, to be honest, at this point in a conflict, that it's still so poorly covered by international outlets, and there's so little news analysis coming out about it. So I think it's disproportionately neglected is shockingly clear. There's all sorts of arguments and counter arguments as to why that might be the case. I kind of disagree with most of them. I think if there was more effort and emphasis on this, it's an easy the gravity of what's happening is an easy sell. It should be of interest to all policymakers, all caring, people around the globe, and it just isn't being broadcast in this way. So, I mean, so I think that's clear, and we have to deal with that. The knock-on impact of it, though, is that now global and even regional powers aren't being confronted enough or cajoled enough to take the right action, and that at a sort of post-COVID, funding levels for the humanitarian response and a sort of aid skeptic period of world history, unfortunately, the low coverage also means there isn't enough support in general to all the groups and organizations and agencies that are trying to help. So we quite clearly feel that the impact of this being a deeply neglected crisis as well. I wish that we could do more to help make sure that there were the human faces. I think one of the issues of the scale of this response is that the numbers just seem so mind-bending that sometimes they don't seem credible to readers, but they are, and we see them, and it should be taken more seriously. And this, as I said earlier, the severity of this really isn't showing through, and the fact that a better response for people, or indeed the pressure to stop this whole set of perpetrated atrocities and more, isn't there. So I think that we really do need to find ways to unlock this. 18, 19 months into this crisis, it's too long. It's clearly here for the long haul. There's an issue with the newsworthiness of some items, but that shouldn't diminish the focus on it. And I guess I'll end, and maybe Nafisa will talk more on it. But I mean, there are things that should resonate with many people in emotional, compassionate sense. There's the shrewd political analysts and so forth that are moved by different facts and features. But the terrible crisis inside Sudan, I think, clearly is spilling over regionally and vice versa. It's clearly, and if we don't help people in Sudan and help relieve the situation immediately, it will have a threat to international peace and security. The 3 million refugees, different armed groups connecting in different ways, food and economic systems having to be partly rewired, but also suffering. So it really, despite the media, it should also be higher on the world, the global policy agenda as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Nafisa, I mean, just quickly, if you have other also thoughts on this, that would be great. And I see more questions coming in, and so we'll start a round of Q&A afterwards.
Sure, yeah, I feel like I'm a biased respondent to this question anyways. But no, I think I just have a few things I want to say. I think one, I mean, I know this literally from firsthand. It is true, Sudan, the resources being, as a resource, the resources being apportioned to Sudan. I'm very lucky to be one of probably the very few people who have, my beat is Sudan, and even my attention is being drawn elsewhere, unfortunately, right? So, and I think that's not necessarily always even a reflection of even my organization's priorities as much as global priorities. There are other conflicts that, although smaller in many ways, are seen as there's more interest in New York and DC and London and Paris in these other conflicts, right? And so that kind of unfortunately filters out down to the rest of the world. I will say also, and this is something I've just been thinking about kind of just maybe nihilistically, social media is really impacting what gets read, right? So when something happens in Sudan, for example, we had a massacre of 125 people. By the time I'm able to get my fact-checked, sourced interviews, all these things out, everyone knows, right? Everyone who cares to know knows, and then everyone else isn't going to read my 700, 800 word article. So, and that's, I mean, you can say it's the fault of readers, but it's also a challenge for journalists to come up with more creative and more impactful ways of telling our stories. And that's like I think something that we have to work on. It's also we're trying to kind of unfortunately we kind of get caught in a cycle of trying to find kind of the worst and worst and worst story in order to maybe hopefully grab someone's attention. I feel like I'm rambling, but that's only because this is kind of something that we're actively trying to find a solution for, and it's very difficult. So I'll stop there just to, so we can get into other questions. But I think I agree with everything that Will and Khulud said.
Thank you all. So I'm going to go through the questions that we have received and then group them together so we can start answering some of them. And I think there were a couple of questions that talks about the role of the African Union, the upcoming Peace and Security Council or Commission election. And I think Khulud mentioned or brought this up in part of her initial remarks. There is also another question about the role of the UAE and the Gulf countries, in particular in the Sudanese war. So I think if we can dig a little bit, maybe take a closer look, Khulud, at role of some of these institutions, whether it's the African Union, whether it's some of these countries. And I remember you finished your first initial remarks by saying that some people look outside what's going to happen on the regional international stage with regards to their position on Sudan, but we need to also remember the internal players and internal dynamics. So if you can just this time just take us from outside African Union, any role that it can play, any serious role for de-escalation, for ceasefire to begin with, that some of the Gulf countries can actually do, any tools that they can use.
Thanks. I mean, if we start with the African Union, I'm going to be absolutely blunt and say that I don't think the African Union is playing any role right now, at least not an effective one. And I think we often refer to the African Union, for several reasons. One, it played a big role in ending Sudan's conflict in 2005, and so there is a hope that that could then be reinvigorated this time round, and of course other rounds of talks in Sudan. So Sudan's had a very long history of peace agreements and peace talks. And the other reason is that we often see the United Nations sort of in an effort to itself abrogate responsibility on Sudan, pass over the Sudan file to the African Union. And what we have here is really, member states really saying that the UN should be dealing with Sudan, trying to find an end to the conflict, etc., and the UN then passing that on to the African Union. And this is on protection, it's on ceasefire, and it's on humanitarian issues. And we see that in the end, actually, Sudan is nowhere. There is no traction in any of these institutions, and member states are not of both institutions are not taking, not being very front-footed about this. So I'm not sure there's any there on the African Union. The good thing is, because largely this is a result of the leadership of the African Union Commission right now, there will be a change of leadership soon. So by next February, perhaps things will look up in terms of what the African Union is prepared to do. The commission is likely to be from the region, either from Kenya or from Djibouti. And this means that you have countries who are actually much more, much closer to what's going on in Sudan. This should be able to, one hopes, take on more responsibility on Sudan. But of course, what we've seen from the African Union itself is that it has failed on many conflicts, not just the one in Sudan. And if we look at, what's going on in the Gulf, which is not unrelated, Gulf countries have had a lot of investment in African countries. There have been a lot of land grabs in African countries. There have been lots of particular investments in African leaders across the continent. And so these things are very much linked to each other. This is a very different regional climate that we find ourselves now than we had 20 years ago, for example. And really what we're seeing is that, these meso powers, as we often call them, whether it's Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, etc., these are countries that are looking towards their own strategic futures. And in many ways, African countries like Sudan fall foul of that. So we have seen these countries, many of whom are joining BRICS or are in the process of joining the BRICS countries. They're looking for, to play politics differently. No longer will they want to just rely, for example, on the largesse of the United States, but they're looking towards China. They're looking looking towards Russia. They're looking towards their own sort of imperial dreams. And the United Arab Emirates in particular is having a sort of very Britannic approach to imperialism, sort of a very small country that wants to project a much larger influence. We've seen that in Yemen, we've seen it in Libya, we've seen it in other parts of the continent, and Sudan is probably just the latest iteration of that. So what, how do we confront that, I guess, is the question, when we're trying to find the solution just for Sudan, when the imperial dreams of some of these Gulf nations is far broader than just Sudan. That is part of the sort of the struggle in trying to figure out how to resolve this current war.
Thank you. I think there were other questions that came in, and I think we'll come back to if you have a quick comment, Khulud, on the U.S. elections that is tomorrow, and is there any potential change that we might see between a Harris or Trump, or other regional actors that might use that election for something else? Just quick minute, if you can just give us a quick.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. The consensus currently is that whether it's Harris or Trump, nothing changes on Africa policy because the US is not that invested in Africa. That's the consensus. However, we know that in Sudan there are a lot of key US allies that are implicated: Egypt, Israel, Saudi, and the UAE. And particularly under a Trump presidency, there may be a sort of a willingness to pick a side effectively, and that would alter the way of things, but it won't necessarily bring about a peace, and certainly may not necessarily bring about any kind of justice or civilian transition. So in the grand scheme of things, yes, there may indeed be an impact, but it may not necessarily be one that we want.
Thank you. Will, I think there were a couple of questions related to the humanitarian crisis. So questions that range from what can we do beside what's happening today or what's happening now? Questions related to how does the international aid translate on the field? How does it move? Does it connect with local or grassroots initiatives? Are there any right now actually on the ground in Sudan? Also the role of borders, like land borders in this case, whether aid coming through Egypt or through Ethiopia or through Chad or any of those land borders, and to what extent they could be helpful in alleviating some of the suffering, not just by people seeking refuge, but also by bringing in goods and food and medicine. So I think if you give us, again, in 3 minutes or so, a sense of how does this move and how does it connect with local actors, I think that would be also very helpful for us.
Sure. And I mean, look, one of the other distinguishing features of the Sudan crisis is the fact that the capital city itself had quickly become a battle zone, and that led to the breakdown of a lot of institutions, banking, telecoms, manufacturing, trade, also the embassies and diplomatic community, not necessarily in the country anymore for the most part. And so we've had this, we're having to work around a lot of problems. And one of the challenges of responding to a crisis, a humanitarian crisis of this scale and complexity, and the fact that the operating conditions are really, really tough, is that this has been quite fragmented. And for the most part, at least for the first few months, there were really few international organizations or UN agencies across the country, very, very few, really. And what we saw was, local communities, Sudanese communities, sometimes through different groups, especially the emergency response rooms, but not only those, many others had put together relief efforts. I've seen firsthand in the first few weeks, really, how collective shelters for people fleeing from the conflict, how communal kitchens were set up and still, going as much as they can, how, certain health facilities have tried to maintain themselves, or, key infrastructure, water or electricity, been partly repaired or rehabilitated. So in some ways, a huge locally sourced relief effort, a lot from the diaspora community, who I think have pockets really paid quite a toll in doing things. And then this sort of sluggish re-entry from the international community in different parts. Most of the UN-led system cloistered up in Port Sudan and neighboring states, and a few organizations trying to work across the country, including across borders. It became a hugely contentious issue to work from Chad into the Darfur region, where we've got this sort of critical food insecurity and atrocities and huge displacement. Until a pressure point was reached, and the president of the Transitional Sovereignty Council, Barhan, had decreed that they shouldn't have an objection to reopening that border, even though it's not militarily controlled by the armed forces, for a period of 3 months, and it will, at the moment, is slated to close in 2 weeks' time. It's really imperative that is continued. There is clearly a worsening famine-like condition across multiple parts of the country. So border crossings like the one in Adre in Chad and other parts, we have to keep open, but it's not a given. Some UN agencies are completely crippled when it's not permitted. Other organizations are a bit freer to work on a humanitarian imperative. But really, we need to have a much stronger international response. And no, to answer your question, there isn't yet a great connectivity between local response efforts and the international community. There's a bit more resources flowing, but the two systems aren't really able to speak, but some good and some not so good reasons. And I think this is part of the evolution that Sudan will help bring, not just for people in Sudan, but globally. I think that this is an important learning moment of how we sort of reconfigure how we respond in really tough crises like this.
Thank you, Will. Nafisa, I'd like to come back to, and again, I think one of the questions in the Q&A was talking about domestic issues. And I want to go back to something you mentioned in the opening remarks around both fragility and fragmentation of local actors, whether it's the militias or groups that the SAF or RSF are relying on in certain parts of the country that are now we're seeing some fractures or some potential even changes in the dynamics. So if you can just give us a little bit more into how is this developing? And the other question connected to this is that would this ever open a chance for a local actor or actors to champion some sort of peace or ceasefire or change this balance of power somehow? What is needed to happen so we can see that type of change, aside, of course, from outside intervention?
All right, so just to kind of maybe lay that out a little bit. So on the army side, while they have kind of carried out a mass popular resistance campaign, we haven't seen a major product of that yet. What we have seen is from quite early in the war, militias such as Kataib al-Barra being kind of the most well publicized, but also others that have a more Islamist, in some cases more extremist bent, fighting alongside the army, as well as, sorry, just to say, members of the intelligence service who are armed, members of the Central Reserve Police who are armed and who are, as Khulud said, the army doesn't have much of an infantry, right? And so these are all people that are brought in as foot soldiers. They are all, I think, in a lot of ways responsible for a lot of the army's kind of improvement in the last improvement of its position in the last few weeks. And that means that eventually they want to extract concessions. And I think some of that's already happened, and some of that we're gonna see even more of. We're also seeing that those forces are committing their own abuses. So most recently in Halfaya and Bahri, there's allegations that the Barra brigade killed about 72 people. So that's on the army side. And as we said, we kind of are seeing calls for popular resistance, but the real impact of those so far has been just increased targeting of civilians rather than any real resistance. On the RSF side, again, as Paul said, like the RSF has always kind of been a kind of combination of different groups with different motivations and different command structures, different control structures. And what we're seeing is that, a lot of them are motivated by the potential for looting. And we've seen that potential has kind of dried up in a lot of parts of Khartoum and a lot of parts of Jazeera. We get reports of soldiers being hungry and soldiers being kind of starting to steal things that are stealing from community kitchens, for example, things like that. And so that means that the RSF has less and less control over these people. And so I'm saying this all to say that I think the outlook is actually quite bleak, because what we're getting is a situation where both the army and the RSF have less and less control over the fighters that are making its advances. So the RSF, I think, pioneered this structure. Well, actually, historically, the army pioneered this structure of just having militias, and the RSF has really kind of improved upon it. And now the army is not learning from that lesson. And so what we're seeing is actually just a proliferation of people who, if you want to come to a ceasefire, you're going to have to convince, or you're going to have to pay, or you're going to have to figure out a way, or you're going to have to, in some cases, I think, in the bleakest senses, kind of figure out a way to just make disappear. And so yeah, I don't see a lot of space for local actors, to be very honest with you. I think it's going to require people with enough either military force or economic force to really convince the actors. It doesn't seem like any kind of pull towards national unity works. There's a lot of resentment between these groups. There's a lot of competing interests between these groups. And yeah, and sorry, just because I feel like I answered the previous question quite badly, I wanted to just say that Sudan is also an extremely difficult environment for journalists. I want to put that out there. I want to make sure that I say that. Even the reports that you are now seeing from a lot of Western outlets, they are all coming, and this is the only way to really get into these areas with the army, right? And so it's all happening under army supervision. The RSF is not an area where we can really safely, I mean, the amounts of permission we have to get just to get a camera to go to like a kitchen in an RSF controlled area is very difficult. So there's also that is like a huge reason why you are not seeing a lot of the coverage. And it's expensive, and kind of go back to the resources part, people aren't necessarily willing to put a lot of money in it. So I just want to say that just to improve upon that answer.
Well, thank you. We have another maybe 10 minutes. So I'd like to, there are maybe one or two questions that I'd like your quick thoughts on, and then like 3 minutes for each of you to wrap up any final remarks. So we talked about the US elections. We didn't talk about China, since we're looking at also other powers that have involvement in Africa. I mean, particularly, we cannot ignore China. Russia is another player in Sudan as well. Not new. Historically, there have been relationships. Are either of those powers have a chance of changing anything, or playing a different role than we're seeing today, or they will also continue delegating to others until they have to really act? The floor is open for any of you who want to take this.
I'm happy to start us off. I think, China is very good at biding its time. China has sort of 1,000-year strategies, which is very unlike, the democracies of Europe and North America that change with every 4 years, perhaps 8 years. So it's willing to wait this out to some degree, but China is very institutionalist. It will back the Sudanese Armed Forces, but it won't completely close the door engaging with others. What we've seen is that China has two envoys. One is the Horn of Africa envoy, one is the sort of MENA envoy, both of whom have been to Sudan in the past 5 or 6 years or so. So it has a lot of interest in Sudan. Part of its Belt and Road strategy does cut, a lot of it actually does cut through Sudan, from Port Sudan to Dakar in Senegal. and it has a whole industrialization sort of agenda in Africa that rests on Sudan being reasonably stable, if not peaceful. So those plans are currently on hold. It has engaged with, for example, the UAE. UAE is increasing its trade with China, and so the China is involved with other countries in the region. But when it comes to Sudan itself, it doesn't play the role it used to play when it was very invested in Sudanese oil during the Bashir years. I think what we've seen is, from Russia, is that Russia backs both sides because it's hedging. It doesn't know who's going to come out on top, and it's figured, because history tells it so, that there is going to be no military victor in all of this, and that most likely SAF and the RSF and some of their allies will strike some kind of devil's bargain in order to live to fight another day, or in order to bring about some kind of reasonably moderate, for them anyway, political dispensation. And so you have, for example, the Wagner Group historically been backing the RSF, while the Kremlin backs the Sudanese Armed Forces, and that gives Russia basically a win regardless. The RSF is important for its Sahel policy. The SAF is important for its Red Sea policy. Russia sees no contradiction in supporting both sides, and it's not as absolutist about some of the ideology issues that are involved. So you have a very different political approach, I think, from Russia and China than you see, for example, from the US or the UK.
Thank you, Khulud. Any other additions, Nafisa or Will? And you don't have to. It's just I'm just curious.
I mean, there's the Russia and China is the P2 other members of the UN Security Council. I'm a big believer that there's much more of a positive role that regional and continental actors can play. There's of course different interests in doing so, and different rewards or disincentives for doing so as well. But I think that there hasn't been a huge engagement from that. We see a couple of the special envoys bouncing between different capitals and trying, but not really backed yet by the full breadth and depth of the governments. And even with the US government, it has a mixed relationship with the UAE and other key players in this conflict. So I think that a lot can still be determined, and even if the precise path to peace isn't clear just yet, the limits of suffering can be reduced by how different parties and their allies are engaged and disincentivized, basically. But at the moment, we're not getting this sort of strength, this challenge to that. So yeah, I do think that there's a role. There's not specific states that want to stay here, but this is what's happening to people in Sudan. Everyone has a responsibility to do more, and definitely from continental and regional bodies. I'm expecting more, even if right now it looks a little bit slow or chaotic.
Thank you, Will. I don't know, Nafisa, do you have anything, or should I ask this other question?
I think go ahead.
So yeah, no, I think there is another also bigger maybe question. For over a decade now, we have seen wars in Yemen, Syria, Libya, that are now settling into these fractured, fragmented, maybe two-sided. Sometimes it's one group and then other smaller groups splintered around. Everyone is controlling a piece of the known country or the state itself. Is Sudan heading into that direction? A Libya example, where you have an East government, a Western government in the West, and a government in the East and a government in the West, or another kind of Yemen version, where you have some group that now claims the majority or controls the majority of the land, but actually it's balanced by others who are dependent on outside actors. So is this the trajectory of what we're seeing this war going to? And if it's not, what can be done to change that trajectory? And I think if each of you can take 2-3 minutes max, I think, before they cut us off, that would be great. And I think this would be the wrapping kind of question and answers segment. Shall we start with Nafisa first?
Sure. So I think I'll keep my comments kind of to the situation on the ground, and then I think Khulud and Will can kind of give maybe some more forward-looking I think a lot is going to depend on the next few weeks and months. A lot is going to depend on whether or not Al-Fashir falls to the RSF or kind of stays in this stalemate, because it's a major city, both economically, politically, strategically. And so that will have a big role to play. I think what happens with Sinad also has a similar importance, because that will also help to kind of create a clean split of the country. And then of course Khartoum, because the army is kind of making inroads, and if it is able to recapture the capital, that might change some of the dynamic as well. The viability of actually splitting the country is I'll let you guys discuss that, because I think your expertise might kind of better inform that.
Thank you, Nafisa. Will?
Yeah, I can't say it's what we understand is the preferred outcome from either of the two main warring parties. And where we still have teams working in Darfur, we haven't seen, like I see in other crises, an immediate imperative to put in place alternative government systems, a bit like the Taliban or other places where they come with this sort of political ideological project. I haven't seen that in Darfur, and we're just getting the remnants of what was there before, more or less, as part of the local authorities. So I don't think it's the predetermined outcome, but it could easily be one of the scenarios that evolves if there isn't a breakthrough on this diplomatic impasse, or whatever the political and military and peace trajectory is. Like a partition is a very serious scenario at play. It's not for me to comment what's better or worse, but I think it's not necessarily an outcome if there's the right level of engagement and care. You don't have to walk down that path. I think in terms of the humanitarian implication of that, it's going to be much more complex, not just because of getting any unobstructed aid through, but just the basic systems of how does the economy work, how do basic services work, how do we get everyone vaccinated in school, people back into livelihoods, will be much more difficult in a partitioned political context. I don't think it's set, but it may well be where we're heading to at the moment if there isn't some sort of better deal at the moment.
Thank you, Will. Khulud, last but not least.
So, I mean, I think that, several things. One, it does seem to be the sort of trajectory of things in the region. But in Sudan, you have, sort of several unique dynamics. I think one, you have currently 4 zones of influence, not just 2. And so even if the country were to split with SAF and RSF, you still have 2 rebel movements, as Nafisa said earlier, that control different parts. So you're already looking at actually more than 2. And that seems much more the likelihood rather than a Libya type scenario. The second thing is that in Libya and in Yemen, both the main groups in control of those in the north and south and east and west, respectively, you had both of them had access to the sea. Excuse me. And for the RSF, it would be landlocked if we were to stay in Darfur. And so it's unlikely that the RSF would settle for a sort of landlocked status. And the other thing is that, with what we're seeing in sort of how this is shaping up is that when we will see, I think by November, by this month, late, in a few weeks' time, the RSF is likely to have launched its counteroffensive. And so I think we will have a much better idea of what their capabilities look like in this fighting season once that starts. And that gives us a better sort of sense of what's going on. But I think we can't forget that Sudan is the country that gave birth to the newest country in the world. Secession in Sudan is not a new thing. And I think what's even more worrying than two states in one country is complete disintegration of Sudan. And for example, having the western part secede entirely, or parts of the south, what is now the southern Sudan, secede entirely too. That would, of course, not be useful, because what you're creating effectively is, instead of one unstable state, several unstable states. So there's no good outcomes, I think, when it comes to partition. And that's why keeping Sudan whole, despite it being very, very difficult in the project of several decades, is imperative.
On this note, as much as it's painful and it's kind of gloomy and pessimistic, but I think your conversation with us today has been really, really helpful and enlightening in the sense of getting to learn more about what's going on and hearing about some of the actors on the ground and the influence of outside actors. Really appreciate your time today, and we hope to meet you again in better circumstances or conversations around more positive outlooks with regards to Sudan and the region. Thank you again, and really appreciate it for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.